Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining the Gordon JCC for the Nashville Jewish Book Series tonight. I'm Sharon Benus, the Adult and Community-Wide Programs Director, and I'm excited to introduce the moderator and the author for this evening. But before we begin, just a few notes. Automated closed captioning can be accessed by clicking the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen and selecting Show Subtitles. We will have a Q&A at the end of the conversation. So if you have a question during the discussion, please place it in the chat and we'll have time to answer them later. We would appreciate if everyone can make sure that they're muted.
All right, I'm muting myself so I can just take pictures if I want to. I have it.
Also, just to let you know, we are recording this video. So if for whatever reason you miss anything, you'll be able to watch it again, and we will keep it in our archives as well. So everyone can enjoy it.
I heard it, sweetie. I heard that. Okay.
Okay, if everyone can just make sure that they're muted. Thank you. So our moderator for this evening is Benjamin Benus. He is an associate professor of art history at Loyola University in New Orleans. He specializes in the history of modern art with a focus on 20th century graphic design. He is the author of a forthcoming book, Herbert Bayer's World Geographic Atlas and Information Design at Mid-Century, which will be out next month from RIT Press. He is also the co-curator of a related exhibition titled Concept of a Visualist, which will open in June at the Aspen Institute's Resnick Center for Herbert Bayer Studies. And our author this evening, just let someone else in, is David Sipress, staff cartoonist at The New Yorker since 1998. He's published nearly 700 cartoons in the magazine. His personal history essays appear often on NewYorker.com. He has lectured widely on cartoons and cartooning. His memoir, What's So Funny, was published in 2022. The New York Times called it an endearingly vulnerable tale of being molded by one's family of origin, then crawling out from under its suffocating weight. So without further ado, I am just trying to, let's see, I am going to spotlight Ben and David so everyone can see them. And okay, you guys are on.
Yay. All right. Thanks so much for that, Sharon. I'm absolutely delighted to be here tonight, and I've really been looking forward to this conversation with you, David. You've written an incredible book. It's funny, it's thoughtful, full of insights, and there's a lot to unpack. And I think maybe just start, one of the things I'll just mention at the outset as someone who teaches art history for a living, I find it almost impossible to speak unless there's some accompanying visual. And so I've asked David to select some cartoons that we might discuss. I've suggested a few additional cartoons that I'm curious to hear about. And so we'll see how far we get with those. It was really difficult because David has so many incredible cartoons to choose from. So it was a difficult choice. But perhaps to get started, I could just ask you to read a couple pages from your introduction, and then we can dive into some of those cartoons we chose.
I would be happy to do that. I'm going to start just posting this photograph. It's coming up. My memoir is about these four people. My father, Nat Sipress, my mother, Estelle, my sister, Linda, and me. Just to give you an idea, my father's towering over us, and he was 5'2". So you get a sense of how small we all were. My father was an immigrant, came to this country in 1910 from the Ukraine, and became an extremely successful businessman with a well-known jewelry store on Lexington Avenue. My mother was a housewife, and you can see she has a very sweet face in that picture. which made it very difficult for me. I called it her outside face to convince anyone that she could be anything but sweet at home. My sister Linda was kind of a troubled soul, and then there's me, and what can I say? Pointing a gun at the camera. So I'm going to read a short bit from the introduction to the book. Getting an echo. This is my introduction. I was born and raised in New York City. You could say that there's nothing particularly special about that, but deep down, I've always felt that there is. Perhaps it's the simple fact that almost all New Yorkers I know have come to the city from somewhere else. I'm from here. Being a New Yorker from the get-go has permanently shaped my worldview. The sun rises on the Upper East Side and sets on the Upper West Side. This cartoon was published in the New Yorker in 2001, making it one of the first I sold to the magazine after 25 years of submitting and being rejected. The idea came to me in the summer of 2000 when I was walking south on Fifth Avenue after an afternoon visit to the Met. Somewhere around 72nd Street, the memory of another long walk on Fifth Avenue popped into my head, and out popped this cartoon. It works that way sometimes, the out-of-the-blue arrival of a fully formed idea. The memory in question involved my parents, my older sister, and me. I was 8 years old. The four of us had gone out to dinner one early summer evening at my parents' favorite restaurant, Gino's, on Lexington Avenue, across the street from my father's shop. There were always well-known people dining at Gino's. A few weeks before, we were there with a friend of my parents, and he pointed out Charles Adams sitting at the bar. I remember thinking that he looked just like one of his drawings, something people would say about me one day. That night, we also saw the actor Montgomery Clift, who was a customer of my father's, sitting at a small table with Arthur Miller, whose literary accomplishments paled, as far as I was concerned, beside the fact that he was married to Marilyn Monroe. As we were on our way out of the restaurant, my father stepped back and reverently held the door for the arriving Bess Meyerson, famous television personality and the first Jewish Miss America. My family's relaxed, primarily secular Jewishness was a complicated and sometimes confusing affair. As a kid, I understood that Jewish was just one thing we were, more fundamental perhaps, but not all that different from our being New Yorkers or Democrats or Brooklyn Dodgers fans. On the other hand, we were always quick to root and celebrate members of our tribe who broke barriers and made it big: athletes, scientists, writers, artists, actors, diplomats, and smart, talented beauty queens like Bess Meyerson. It wasn't dark yet when we walked out onto Lexington Avenue. There was a fancy black limousine parked in front of the restaurant. The uniformed chauffeur was leaning against the fender, holding a leash, at the end of which a little French poodle leapt back and forth, barking like a maniac at the door of Gino's. "He's funny," I said to my mother. "I wonder who he belongs to." "Whoever it is, they better own a pair of earplugs," my father said. The poodle came over to me, looked up, and barked at me like I was the problem. "Don't get too close," my mother warned. "It's the little ones that really bite." "Let's go," my sister pleaded. She was always impatient, especially when the four of us were out together. My mother suggested we take a walk on Fifth Avenue before getting a taxi back to our apartment on the Upper West Side. "All right, but I just hope we can find a cab," said my father, suddenly sounding grumpy for no apparent reason, as so often was the case. "They aren't so frequent on Fifth," he explained. "Fifth goes downtown," my sister chimed in. "They won't want to take us." "All we can do is ask," said my mother. "Maybe we can ask Fifth Avenue to go uptown," I said. My mother laughed. We walked in spite of my father's misgivings, still hearing the poodle halfway to Park Avenue. When we turned onto Fifth, this taxi after vacant taxi sped by without my father lifting his hand to signal. I looked up and was startled by the sight of the dreamy, sparkling skyline of Central Park South in Midtown Manhattan, silhouetted against a dusky pink sky, and I felt a powerful surge of desire. When I grew up, I told myself I was going to escape the New York of my parents and find a way into the New York I saw glittering above the treetops of Central Park. It would be a New York full of cool, amazing, talented people, like the actors and famous writers and artists I saw dining at Gino's. People who didn't need to worry about every little thing. I would be an artist too, I decided. What kind of artist would I be? I knew that I loved to draw. I also knew that I was funny. At least my mother thought so. I did the calculation. Drawing plus funny equals cartoonist.
That is just such a wonderful introduction. And one of the things that I really love about it is the way it establishes this thread that runs through the entire book. And it relates to the question of identity. Who do you want to be? Who do you want to become? And how does that relate to the place that you come from, the New York of your parents? It seems to me that a lot of the humor in the book is a distinctly New York humor, and I suppose that's maybe another way of saying Jewish humor. And I'd be curious to hear you talk a little bit about that aspect of the book. One of the cartoons that I suggested we might look at is the Christmas chapter one, and so perhaps we could start there.
Okay. There you have it. This cartoon expresses what I spoke about in the introduction, the confusion I felt about our Jewishness, and it epitomized by the fact that we celebrated both Hanukkah and Christmas. We celebrated Hanukkah in the kitchen and Christmas in the living room. So the two never kind of intermingled and got contaminated. So yeah, that's what this cartoon is about.
Yeah, I think it's just such a wonderful image, and I'm curious in terms of like reception. Have you, for some of these cartoons where there's maybe not a particular caption, and you're leaving the meaning of the cartoon to the audience, have you gotten feedback about how people maybe understand some of these cartoons that are more open-ended?
Well, the captionless cartoon is kind of, we cartoonists consider it the highest form of the art. If you can say what you want to say without using words, that's perfect. And people love this cartoon, especially Jewish people, because it's an experience I think a lot of people who were brought up Reform Jewish can relate to. So the response to this has always been terrific. I've used it as a holiday card and stuff like that. So yeah, and I'm always proudest of the cartoons that are captionless.
Oh, it's so interesting. There's another one that I'd thought of along those lines that's also captionless, but different than this, wasn't created for, I think, another audience. You say in your book that this was a cartoon that you had really just created for yourself, and it involves your father and his store. But I think also, yeah.
So my father's store was called Revere Jewelers, and his lifelong quest was to become assimilated. And he did everything he did, the way he dressed, the way he spoke, everything was his part of that quest. And I'll talk about it later, but he was very secretive about his immigrant past, didn't like to talk about it, didn't like to think about it. And he somehow in Revere Jewelers, he began to become to some of his WASP customers, Mr. Revere. And that's what I tried to show in this, that he's thinking of himself as Mr. Revere, kind of a Jewish Paul Revere, but and the WASP lady who he's customer is seeing him for exactly who he is. And I was extremely uncomfortable and confused by this as a kid. I didn't really understand what was going on. Yeah, so that's the story behind this one.
No, it's again such a great image that says so much just pictorially. But one thing I'm also just curious about is to what extent when you're working on cartoons, whether you know that they are cartoons that you're creating for an audience or ones that you're, because I think you mentioned this one as one that was clearly just kind of for yourself to kind of work through an idea. I wonder if you'd say something about that.
Yeah, I mean, people say, do you try to do New Yorker cartoons or something like that with the audience in mind? I've never done that before I was in the New Yorker, and after I was in the New Yorker, all I do is David Sipress cartoons. What's so amazing and wonderful about what we do, we cartoonists, is that you put an aspect of yourself out there, often a very private aspect, in a cartoon, and lo and behold, people share your feelings, share that experience, and they laugh. And so I've never felt the need to think of doing a cartoon for anybody. I do cartoons about what my experiences are, what I feel, what I perceive. And I've been really lucky that the audience has connected to me that way. So that's my answer to that question.
No, it seems like one of the, I think, sort of great pleasures of these cartoons is the kind of self-recognition that the audience experiences, that it's something relatable and that we kind of recognize from our own lives, which I think is often what's so compelling about them. To return to your father, since he looms so large in the memoir and as you talk about in the memoir and your own life, it seems like you were really driven by a curiosity about his identity, about how he thought about his past, and that seemed to be something that was in that Paul Revere cartoon as well. And so I wonder if you'd talk a little bit more about that sort of curiosity and about your father.
Well, as I mentioned, not unusual for his generation. He really didn't, he was very secretive about that immigrant past, about his life in the shtetl when he was a boy, and about his life living in impoverished circumstances in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, when his family came here. And in fact, he became alienated for reasons that are shrouded in mystery from his entire original family, so that I never met them, really know any, or I only met them many, many years later. And he was very secretive. And I did this next cartoon kind of to show the limits of what my father revealed about his past. Sorry, working on this. The country Papa came from was a stinking hellhole of unspeakable poverty where everyone was always happy. And I have to say, it's one of my favorite captions. I'm going to talk a little later about caption writing, perhaps, but captions need to have a rhythm, a kind of a rhythm. And I feel like this one has a wonderful rhythm and has what we think of as the kicker at the end. The laugh comes at the very end. And I was very proud of stinking hellhole of unspeakable poverty. Some of my favorite words I've ever put together. But that image is my father and his very limited revelations about growing up and his past.
And so in the course of writing the memoir, did any of that mystery, the basis of that mystery emerge? Did you learn anything about where that alienation, that split came from?
My father never talked about his feelings, never talked about stuff like that, and not only never any details about the past, but as time went on, I got little snippets, some from some snooping I did around the apartment, but also at the very end of his life, actually at the very end of his life, he said more in one visit than he'd ever said before. But still, the past remains a mystery. And to tell you the truth, members of his family have contacted me when I was just about the cartoons and then about the book. And I've never felt the urge to connect with them and find out more, just because it felt like a kind of betrayal of my father. I can't really explain, but I've never gone there. Maybe I will someday, but I'm happy with the mystery. Mystery is good for a good book.
Yeah, certainly it is a thread running through this book, sort of trying to understand what is in your parents' minds, but in particular your father's mind, what he maybe expects of you or desires for you. And so much of the book seems to be your kind of trying to work through what you want versus what your parents or you imagine they expect for you.
Well, that brings us to this cartoon, of course. We've been thinking about what we want to do with your life. And that was my experience. As I said, my father, coming from where he came from, he has very specific ideas for what he wanted his son to be, and cartoonist was not on that list. So I went to college and I studied history, Russian history, and then I went on to Harvard and in a graduate program in Russian history. And for my father, it was everything, because his customer would come in, they talk about the emerald cufflinks, and they say, "Oh, by the way, did I mention my son is at Harvard?" He loved that. And so I was miserable. I knew that I wanted to be an artist. I knew I was living the wrong life, but it was very hard to turn my back on my father and my mother too in that way. But finally I did, which laid one of the episodes in the book that's a little upsetting, but reflects the how difficult the moment was when I told my father. But like everything, one of the things I discovered doing this book is that there's almost nothing I've experienced in my life that I haven't done a cartoon about. And so I did this cartoon about that whole experience. You're quitting school after everything we sacrificed for you? So, yeah.
No, I love this one. I think for so many reasons. One, it just raises for me all kinds of questions about the creative process. Does the obviously it's a play on the figurative use of the word sacrifice and making it literal, and so I wonder, does the caption sort of occur to you in this case, and then you think about what that would look like as an image?
Well, people ask that, and I have to say the experience is kind of mushed together. One doesn't necessarily come first before the other, but in order to talk about it, I can sort of divide the process into, first, the most important part, the creative part, is the coming up with ideas. Where do you get your ideas? And I answer it in several ways. One of the ways I get my ideas, and I'm going to put something else up here, is by making a drawing and then looking at the drawing and trying to figure out what the cartoon is. What's the funny in that image? And this one I did, and I looked at this drawing forever, and I thought of cartoons, maybe one about, thou shalt not cover thy neighbor's wife, or maybe a 11th commandment, something about having brunch, but none of them seemed to work. And then I realized that the cartoon was right there all the time, right in the drawing. I didn't have to go outside the drawing to come up with it. One question: with such a big hand, how did you write so small? So sometimes the ideas begin like that. Another way that the ideas come is I have something I think of as my cartoon brain, which is always on in every situation, always trying to see what's funny about what's going on and what I can use. I have a wonderful example of that. I got to go back again here. This cartoon has a story behind it. Maybe I'll wait to show it until I tell the story. My wife and I were once having a rather spirited argument. And what I was going to say was that the cartoon brain often functions in situations where it's not exactly appropriate. So we're having an argument. My wife is an excellent arguer. She's an attorney. And at one point she looked at me and she said, "David, you're not thinking up a cartoon right now, are you? Oh, no, I'm not thinking up a cartoon. I couldn't possibly doing that. Meanwhile, my cartoon brain was functioning, and a few weeks later, she saw this cartoon in the New Yorker. Well, if it really doesn't matter who's right and who's wrong, why don't I be right and you be wrong? So that's an example of how it functions all the time. Another way, the main way that my ideas come is that I don't sit down and go to my studio and think, I'm going to come up with a funny joke today. I think, as I said before, about what I experience. Mostly I think about my worries and anxieties. A lot of humor comes out of worry and anxiety, and mine in particular. So, and I have no shortage of worries and anxieties. Try thinking about something else. So if I have like for instance, an upcoming doctor's appointment that I'm particularly nervous about, that resulted in this cartoon. Don't forget to call it a procedure, makes it less scary. And this next cartoon I'm going to show is my most popular cartoon. It's been shared and stolen and reprinted every time I look up, and it's especially sort of dominates the internet whenever the world is kind of going to hell. And it's an example of my worrying about political stuff and what's going on in the world. And I'll talk about it in a second, but I thought I would show it. My desire to be well informed is currently at odds with my desire to remain sane. So that's how I deal with my worry about what's going on in the world. And it's typical of my cartoons about that stuff, because it doesn't sort of hit you over the head with a particular point of view. I make cartoons about how I feel about what's going on. And as I said before, sometimes that connects with my audience and how they feel. And this is definitely an example of that. So worrying about what's going on in the world, ideas come from that. And of course, I'll show one more, the big thing that, of course, we all worry about, that's been the source of a lot of my cartoons. Thank goodness you're here. I can't accomplish anything unless I have a deadline. So
Yeah.
tell me if I'm going on too much, but
No. I think, one thing that strikes me with several of the cartoons that you've, all these kind of anxiety themed ones, is they seem to suggest also something about how cartoons themselves are a kind of way to manage anxiety or to create some distance, perhaps through humor, right? The guy's wife telling him to think of something else, or the euphemism, call it a procedure. In some ways that seems to be also poking fun at what we sort of try to do with cartoons, make things that are scary to us kind of manageable.
yes, exactly. And that certainly works for me as a cartoonist. I don't actually think of them as therapy, but I have, and especially writing the book, I realized that how lucky I am to be an artist, to have a creative outlet, especially one that employs humor, because of course, can't avoid painful and difficult things in your life, but I always had that that place to go to feel better about things. And I'll talk more about that at the end, but I agree completely. And I think cartoons are wonderful in that they give people a way of laughing at themselves and laughing at their own stress and anxiety.
Yeah, one thing to go back for a moment that I was thinking about as well. You were talking about your parents and the sort of struggle to carve out your own path in the face of what you felt were their expectations. But you do talk about a kind of artistic sensibility that you inherited from, I think, both of them at different points in the book. You talk about finding artworks by both of your parents, and maybe you could talk about that a bit as well.
Yeah, interestingly, my mother was very talented. She made beautiful paintings, and but it was always a hobby. It wasn't her life's work. And for my father, in the era before, when photography was so useful, in his jewelry store, every single piece of silver, of jewelry, of anything that went through his store, bought or sold, he made these beautiful little pencil drawings on index cards of them. And I was after he died, I was very, very moved by when I opened up his drawer of what he called his inventory with all his index cards, and I pulled one out and I turned it over. There was this beautiful drawing of a dog that he had. Oh, there goes my cat. Sorry about that. A beautiful drawing of a dog that really moved me and made me feel connected to him, because I realized what I'd always known was he was, as much as he objected to art as a career for me, he was a bit of an artist himself. Yeah.
And your mother as well. I think you mentioned that she also created illustrations and paintings.
Yeah, she made a children's book that was very beautiful. And she played the piano beautifully. She was very talented. So I came by it honestly. Yeah.
And in spite of your father's misgivings, it seemed like the New Yorker as a venue for your cartoons was something that he was quite proud of when he learned that you'd sold a drawing to the New Yorker.
I mean, that's a little bit of a sad story, because I think that he was a little bit proud of when I told him that. But what happened was that he and I didn't know, and I only found out later, that just because you sell a cartoon to the magazine doesn't mean it's going to get published right away. So I sold the cartoon in October, my first one, and first person I told after I told my wife, and it was really, as I said, it took me 25 years to get in the magazine. It was one of the great days of my life. And after I called my wife, I called my father, and he seemed somewhat slightly proud. However, that was in October. And then every week I would get this call from him. Hello, David, I got my New Yorker. You're not in there. And then after a little while it was, are you sure you sold that cartoon? And the fact was that my father died the end of December, and the cartoon didn't come out till July, so he never got to see it, which is a little bit sad for me. Yeah.
One thing I'd be curious to hear a bit more about is this process of submitting works to the New Yorker. And as you talk about, it was many years before the New Yorker accepted one of your cartoons. And so I wonder if you could just sort of walk us through how you kind of persisted in that, and then what the process is like, to what it involves.
Well, the persistence was all about the fact that for what I do, there's the New Yorker and then there's everything else. And I was never able to think of myself as a success until I was in there. So it wasn't even a question of whether I would continue to submit. I just did. So I would submit to them, and then when they rejected them, I would send them somewhere else, but always first to them. And then finally, there was a change in editorship, and I sold my first one, and I've sold many since. But still, the process is a little bit painful, because we cartoonists hand in 10, 12, 15 rough drawings a week, and they're culled by the cartoon editor, who then narrows them down to 50 or 60 out of over 1,000 that she looks at every week. And then there's a meeting with David Remnick, the editor, on Wednesday, and he chooses the few, and I mean the few, that actually sell and get into the magazine. So if I sell 15 or 20 a year, I'm doing really well, and yet my drawers are full of hundreds and hundreds of rejections. So if you do what I do, you have to have a kind of thick skin about rejection. So those 25 years really toughened me up to deal with the weekly rejection that happens. What's funny is though that if I have a cartoon I really love that they reject, I submit it over and over and over again. Maybe sometimes I change it a little, but eventually I can show a quick example of that. Should I do that?
Sure.
Or
Yeah, please.
it's just funny. Let me scroll down to this. I handed this one in, and it got rejected over and over again. I thought, that's a good cartoon. Use your core. And then, bam! I realized what the problem was. Use thy core, and it sold immediately the following week. So sometimes it's useful to me to resubmit cartoons.
So that's really interesting. You're sort of, I'd wondered about whether, there was feedback, comments about cartoons, but it sounds like in some ways you take the rejection as a way to reevaluate what you're submitting.
Yeah, absolutely. I've sold many cartoons that I've resubmitted. And it's a kind of teacher. I try to think of it, I'm not really all that evolved, but I like to sound like I am. And I think of it as a teacher. I learned a lot from what's been rejected, but mostly it makes me pretty miserable. But anyway.
And so what do you attribute that that sudden shift after all those years? Is it that there was a kind of change in taste with the new editor that kind of caught up with where maybe humor was going, or where your humor was? Or
Well, there had been, the previous editor had a stable of people that he depended on, but he over the years let a few wonderful people in, like Roz Chast, Jack Ziegler, but I needed him to not be there so that my friend Bob Mankoff could take over, and I knew he loved my drawings. And so there was a change, and the magazine changed a lot in a lot of ways around the time he took over. So that's the answer to that question.
When I know you also had talked about a sort of similar, not quite a revision, but a cartoon that you had sort of struggled to figure out the hook or the caption for a while, and I think that's maybe the one in the passage that you had talked about reading, and so maybe we can shift to that before we go to the audience for questions.
Okay, I'm just going to put the first this cartoon up. Whoops. Come on, let's go. Getting there. So this is the drawing that you're talking about, and I'm just going to read a short passage from the end of the book. My wife and I retreated to Montauk, New York, to recover from probably the worst thing that ever happened to both of us in our lives, and to me in particular. We were sitting on the balcony of this beautiful room looking out over the ocean. And this little bit that I'm reading kind of gets to what cartoons mean for me and what they give me in my life. I went into the room and brought back my small leather portfolio. I unzipped it and took out 2 copies of a drawing I'd brought with me. Look at this, I said, and I showed her the first drawing, which is what you're looking at. She smiled. That's always hanging above your desk. I smiled. That's right. The fact is, I've been staring at it forever because I've always been convinced that there's a terrific cartoon idea hidden in plain sight somewhere inside it. It's like when something is on the tip of your tongue and you just can't come up with it, but for years. And then for the first time, I sat down at my desk since everything happened, and I was contemplating it as usual. And before I realized what was happening, I added this to it. Sorry. So I put down the first drawing and showed her the second, which is this. Ah, that's fantastic, Ginny exclaimed. I love it. Listen, I said, when an idea comes to me like this, it's as if it happens to me, almost as if I had nothing to do with it, like it came out of the nowhere, a gift from the cartoon gods. And I know this sounds over the top, but every time it happens like that, I get this rush, an intense physical pleasure that feels like pure joy. And it's like fireworks go off in my brain, starbursts behind my eyes. More than anything else about my work, it makes me love what I do. Ginny started to say something, but I stopped her with a raised finger. As long as I can have that experience, I went on, as long as I can sit down and draw, come up with ideas, blow my own mind once in a while with what pops into my head, I will always feel like everything is going to be all right. Since I was a little kid, I held up the drawing and shook it. This has been my happy place. Versteh?
Versteh.
Yes. She verstayed.
I think that's really maybe a wonderful place to open it up. If there are questions in the chat, or if let's see, there's a question. Are there cartoonists that influenced you?
Oh yes, definitely. I've been wanting to be a New Yorker cartoonist since I was a little kid, and it was those artists I first encountered as a kid that have always stuck in my mind and been the most influential to me. Saul Steinberg, who is a hero for many cartoonists, for me in particular, because he taught me what the magical thing that a line can be, all the different things a line can do. I was always very influenced by him. And then over the years, about a number of others, not so much influence, but I enjoy the work of a lot of my colleagues. One in particular is Sam Gross, wonderful, probably the funniest cartoonist that's ever lived. And I love his work. And there are many others. I hesitate to name anybody because then I would leave people out. So.
Another question is, has your sister figured in your cartoons?
No, that's a dark story. One of the challenges of writing this book was, how can I write about difficult things like my sister without losing the tone of the book, which I'm a funny guy. I'm supposed to be funny. And so I had to figure that out. So no, she's never been part of my cartoon life. No.
And I don't know if are people able to
Yeah, people can also, if they want to.
can also ask by voice.
They
or
can
is
ask by
that,
voice too.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that's an option as well. Maybe as people are thinking about questions, I can ask another one that I've been curious about, which is you mentioned that the feedback from the editors tends to be in the form of rejection, but often the captions are very grammatically specific. There's very specific punctuation or a decision to underline a particular word or capitalize it. And is that entirely you, or is that in dialogue with an editor? Because it seems like it's very precise.
That's an interesting question. The New Yorker is famous for two things, for copy editing and fact checking. And cartoonists are not are still affected by those things. When I write a caption, every single thing in that caption I think about, every punctuation mark, make sure I've got the right word order. It's really an art, writing those thin filaments, and you don't want anything to disrupt the reader's experience. So I've had some conflicts over the years when a fact checker a copy editor will correct the grammar in one of my captions, and I've said to them, that may be correct, but it's not how people speak. And I have to stick to what sounds like what people actually say.
And then it sounds like the fact checkers also play a role, as well as the copy editors.
I have a quick story about that. I did a cartoon of a sort of a Greek scene with a temple in the background and a priest pulling a goat, and the goat is saying to the other goat, "I'm having my entrails read." And I got a note from the cartoon editor saying that the fact checkers had a problem with the knife. It was straight and it's supposed to be rounded. And they had a problem with the number of columns in the temple. They were odd and they needed to be even. And I wrote back and I said, I have this question for the fact checkers. I understand their problem with the temple. I understand their problem with the knife. What I'm wondering is, why didn't they have a problem with the fact that there's a talking goat? That's my experience with the fact checkers.
Yeah, I suppose it's a certain mentality that that you need to be a fact checker. A couple more questions have come in. One question: what is what's the most favorite cartoon of yours?
Well, that's hard to say. I have so many. I really have trouble identifying a favorite. I love all my children. So I don't really have an absolute favorite. But many of my favorites are in the book. I'll say that.
Yeah. So in selecting the cartoons for the book, your decisions were somewhat shaped by, your favorites or one that you could.
If there's a couple of seconds more, if me tell a brief story.
Sure.
I wrote a draft of the book. It took me about a year. And then I showed it to my first reader and my most dependable editor, my wife. And she joked that she had to have 2 therapy sessions before she had the conversation with me, when she told me, "It's not good, David. And the problem is, it's not funny." And so I spent another year rewriting it. And then I started choosing more and more cartoons, because I had realized, as I said before, that I'd made a cartoon about just about everything I've experienced. So the ones in the book are mainly grow out of the narrative, the ones that seemed appropriate to the storytelling.
Okay. A couple other questions. One is has your Russian history influenced you in your cartoons? And I'm guessing maybe we're talking about your study of Russian history, if I'm interpreting it correctly.
I think it's always been something that I'm interested in. I don't know that it's worked its way into my cartoons necessarily, but those years, academic years, weren't entirely wasted. I feel like I learned how to write, which is really important, even if you're just writing little captions, but also if you're writing a book. And I continue to be interested in history. I think it's the most wonderful form of storytelling for me. I read history all the time, Russian history and other history. And so as a storyteller, I have been influenced by the storytelling of history.
Another question comes in. There was a cartoon in your memoir which you spoke about creating on difficult situations. I believe this one was after 9/11, with situations being heavy lately. How do you find creating a cartoon without being distasteful?
It's a real challenge. But I try to stick to what I talked about before. If I can tap into what I'm feeling about the bad stuff that's going on, it connects with the reader. And it's so interesting to me that humor isn't always just about the joke. As I said before, humor is about surprising the reader with something they didn't expect, but also comforting them with something familiar. And that combination works, even writing cartoons about really tragic and difficult situations. Timing is important. I'm still not ready to do a cartoon about the war in Ukraine. It took a long time for the magazine to start publishing cartoons after 9/11. And I can tell you that one of the interesting things that happened there was that if you handed in a drawing that had a building in it, or an airplane or anything that might spark a memory of what happened, it immediately got rejected. So you have to be careful, but it can be done. I think it's a wonderful challenge for me as an artist.
To go back to the question of writing for a moment, you talk about how Russian history, your study of it really kind of shaped your understanding of writing, and that is both important for captions, but also for something like a memoir. Had you written long form texts prior to this, or was this a kind of a new foray?
I had started writing essays, personal history essays for the New Yorker. So I had written a number of those, but even, I mean, at the beginning of the process of, everyone kept saying, David, you got to write a memoir. You got to write a memoir. And I thought, okay, I'll write a memoir. And then I did a cartoon about how I felt. It's a person sitting at their laptop, and it says on the laptops, nothing interesting has ever happened to me, a memoir. Sort of how I felt at the beginning, but the stories were rattling around in my head. And I think what you learn about writing is the only way to write is to write. And so I hung in there and I started writing, and pretty soon I was loving it. And the stories just came out and came out. So I don't know if I answered your question, but
yeah. I think another aspect of that question is the role that memory plays. And did you feel like the stories were all sort of there as you can recall them, or did you need to check back with friends and family and relatives to kind of confirm the version that you have? Or?
As a longtime victim of therapy, one thing I've learned is that, and it's so interesting to me, is that it's not necessarily getting everything fact checked and perfectly right isn't as important as recognizing the way you remember things, because the way that I remember things tells more about me than any fact check version of the past could. It took me a while to accept that. And that when I did, it really liberated me and allowed me to write my memories the way I remember them and not worry too much about it. One of my favorite memoirs is by John le Carré, the wonderful writer. And in his memoir, The Pigeon Tunnel, he says, memory is as elusive as a wet bar of soap. And I agree with that. And I think it's also fungible. And I'm allowed to put down the way I remember things, because that says more about who I am. So, yeah.
I think that's a really important point, that memory is something that's contingent and that changes, and it's perhaps more what it can do for you in helping orient you and giving a way to you to think about yourself.
Yeah.
And also, it sounds very like the whole process is very therapeutic as well. I mean, like art in itself is, a form of therapy. And I think, putting words to the image is also a way to pull that together.
I would agree. Yeah. I mean, I don't ever think of it as therapy, but like I said in that excerpt I read, it's my happy place. And I'm always just so grateful that I have that place to go to when things get difficult.
Yeah, well, it's a really inspiring memoir, and I can't recommend it enough. It's really absolutely wonderful. So appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about it.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us, Ben. Thank you so much for moderating the conversation. And David, it's a really wonderful book. And it really hits also just about, family and relationships and the sibling dynamic too. That really touched me. So Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and thank you everyone else for joining us. We have 2 more programs in this series left, and you can learn more about them at nashvillejcc.org/book. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye now.
Okay, thanks.
Have a
Good
wonderful
night.
evening, everyone.